conservatives. Jewish lawyers for the mediator organizations were some of the most fascinating of the many interesting lawyers I interviewed. They were smart, articulate, and highly self-conscious about their roles as Jews in the conservative movement. And I want to read to you from just transcripts of just two of the interviews with these lawyers from mediator groups from different generations, because I think that their stories may reflect larger trends in the roles of Jewish lawyers in the conservative movement. One lawyer in his 60s described the day when he switched his registration from Democrat to Republican, primarily, he said, because he had lost faith in the liberal agenda. He said he changed parties primarily for deeply rooted moral reasons. His disagreement with liberals, he said, revolved primarily around liberals' rejection of this lawyer's most basic assumption about the goodness of America and its capacity to achieve social justice, and his rejection of liberals', and again I'm quoting, contempt for the middle class from which he came. But he described the experience of switching parties as a profoundly disorienting one. He said, "I'm Jewish. The best man at my wedding was a Democratic member of Congress with a 100% voting record with the ADA. But in the most morally courageous act of my life, I went to get the card, a registration card, checked the box called Gulp Republican, signed the form, and went to the postal box and stuck it in and became, as I said at the time, the only Republican I knew. And having done it, I didn't feel Jewish for 6 months." Later, of course, I started associating with some of the people who had gone through pretty much the same emotional identity experience I went through. And he went on to elaborate on how different his experience was in that sense from the experience of some of the younger conservatives he knew, including younger conservative Jewish lawyers for whom not the same kinds of identity contortions and repudiation of the past weren't required. One of these younger Jewish lawyers described his own quite different experience this way. He said, "Growing up in New York City in the 1970s, our taxes were unbearably high. There were no services. It was hard to have a lot of faith in big government. My parents were both school teachers. They constantly talked about how they were being ripped off by the unions, how corrupt the system was, how they weren't rewarded, how awful public schools were, how many welfare cheats there were, how often the welfare families didn't have the same kind of values as the other families, even poor families that they encountered. And all I did was just listen to them. I listened to them about the dangers of drugs, about the fact that there's right and wrong, and they wonder why I became a Republican. I wonder why they've remained Democrats." I know, 2 reasons. First reason is they're from New York and everyone's a Democrat. And because they're Jews. And there's this long tradition of Jews being Democrats. And I used to say that my grandfather, everything he said was incredibly right-wing and conservative, even frankly paleocon. But it's as if that he would go into the ballot box intending to vote Republican, and the hand of God would come and move his hand to the left. And my parents, it is not to say my parents have never voted Republican. They have, as opposed to my grandfather, who I'm sure never did. But their identity is pretty much Democratic. I didn't have any of that baggage. This lawyer said that he was part of a large network of observant Jewish lawyers who were involved in conservative movement politics. Lawyers associated with mediator groups play important roles, and I spent a lot of time in this in the book, play important roles in holding together the conservative coalition because they help to bind together seemingly disparate constituencies that have done a lot of sparring, particularly over the last few years. In particular, they help bridge the divide between libertarian and business constituencies, where, incidentally, most of the other Jewish lawyers appear, and the Christian right. What are we to make of these Jewish lawyers who serve the mediator groups? It would be wrong, I think, to suggest that they simply seek to appease the Christian conservatives in the interests of maintaining a successful electoral coalition, although that may be part of the answer. They certainly do not endorse the goal of some evangelical conservatives of making this a more Christian nation, but they do appear to share some common ground with the Christian right. They agree that there should be more room for religious expression in public life and that government should not support secular values over religious ones. They are not uncomfortable with the Bush administration's values positions and more generally the values positions of the supported by the GOP. Some of them also believe that Christian evangelicals are shunned by the elite establishment in much the same ways that Jews historically have been, and some of them identified with Christian evangelicals as parts of a disfavored religious group, much as Jewish cause lawyers have allied themselves with left cause lawyers have identified themselves with society's underdogs. I don't want to convey the impression that I think that Jewish conservatives are the central players in these mediator organizations, although they do play important roles. I actually don't think that they are the central players. I'm going to leave you with a diagram that I don't have time to adequately explain. It's a diagram of the communication network among 24 of the interviewed lawyers. And it shows the links between lawyers based on contacts of at least 2 or 3 times per year during the 12 months prior to the interview, according to them. And the overall pattern, as you see, is a tightly linked core with several flanks. The top of the figure includes only religious conservatives and abortion opponents. The lower right is exclusively composed of business advocates. And the figure suggests that religion is somehow related to the structure of the network of conservative lawyers, but it also suggests that Jewish lawyers are, for the most part, on the periphery. They're on the lower flank of this network, not in the core for the most part. So I know that these remarks raise as many questions as they answer, and I welcome your thoughts about how to account for the patterns I've described and whether, in fact, they actually correspond with any larger trends in the political participation in America.